Thanks again for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast, including YouTube. Do us a favor and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Hit the bell for notifications, comment, and upvote as well. We'd appreciate it very much. Also, join our Subtext community. It is in the description, the link for it. You can do that. If nothing else, view it as a tip for all this wonderful content that I provide. So we appreciate that very much. Anyway, this past weekend, I decided to do something that was I shouldn't have done, but I did. And that was go play on a message board. And I'm not going to name any names or what's going on, but one of the threads on the message board was essentially the gist of it was that Ole Miss fans need to be wary because of people that are saying the schedule is not brutal. And the word brutal was used, okay? And that people are doing that are just setting it up for I told you so's when Ole Miss fails. Okay. That post was setting up an excuse for when Ole Miss fails. So either way, you're talking about Ole Miss failing in that situation. But that I digress. That's crazy. Ole Miss's schedule in 2023 is brutal because of Georgia. That's the reason the schedule is brutal. And if you take out the Georgia game, because no reasonable fan is going to hold losing to Georgia in Athens against Lane Kiffin, against this Ole Miss football program. Heck, it's the reason that I'm kind of floating. I'm like, my rule is, okay, that Lane Kiffin's making $9 million a year. The baseline, the floor of this team should be 9 wins. I mean, or else what are you paying for? If he's paying $8 million, but since Georgia's on the schedule, I'm willing to be okay with 8 wins. Ole Miss goes 8-4, I'm fine with it. Now, I do think that Ole Miss has the ability to win 10 games this season. I think they have the ability to win 6 games this season too. And that doesn't change what is a success and what is a failure. This is just showing the spectrum of where this team could finish. If you're trying to be a realist, you have to top end it and low end it as well. Now, if you look at our schedule in 2023, everybody talks about that Tulane game being a major thing. And yes, that game is absolutely going to be Tulane's Super Bowl. It's going to be 100 degrees down there. It's going to be outdoors. It's going to make Ole Miss fans not want to go to New Orleans again. I mean, that's just going to happen. But what's his name? Tyjae Spears is not on that team. The player that averaged 12 yards per carry and rushed for over 200 yards against USC is not walking through that door. This is a team that 24 months ago, Ole Miss put 60 points on. Now, they've changed. They're a good football team. They're well coached, but Ole Miss is going to be favored by a touchdown or more in that game. Can Ole Miss lose that game? Yes. Ole Miss has lost to Memphis. Ole Miss has lost to Jacksonville State. Any team can lose any football game. But if you're looking at probabilities, that probably isn't going to happen. The reality is on the Ole Miss schedule that Ole Miss is going to be probably favored in 8 games on their schedule in 2023. That doesn't scream brutal to me. The Georgia game, that's going to be an L. Whenever I do W's and L's in July, that's going to be an L. They're going for a three-peat national championship. But honestly, if we're going to be honest, in the regular season, Ole Miss is the second hardest game on Georgia's schedule. Absolutely nuts, but it is the case. And the Alabama game, you get them in September. Bryce Young is not on that team. Will Anderson is not on that team. Now, I understand there's 4 and 5 stars and they've recruited really well, but you're dealing with a young team playing in September in 2023. Now, Alabama's probably going to be favored by 10 points in that game, but that is not a game that is not winnable for Ole Miss. It's not like a Georgia-type situation. It is a game where Ole Miss absolutely has the talent to overwhelm that Alabama team offensively. LSU. The lines came out this week. This is the third hardest game on Ole Miss's schedule, and LSU came out as like a 3 or 4 point favorite in Vaught-Hemingway. Like I said, all of this is not saying brutal schedule to me. You know what a brutal schedule would be? If Georgia was on the schedule like this year, but instead of Georgia Tech, Ole Miss played USC for an 8-game schedule plus USC. Yeah, that would be a brutal schedule, but your non-cons right now are actually, in my opinion, lesser than it was in 2022. And I challenge anybody to look at this year's schedule and find me a 5-game segment like the end of last season. And even then, I say that last season it was sabotage. But whenever you go to College Station or to LSU, to College Station, you play Alabama with Bryce Young and Will Anderson after an off week. The next week you go to Fayetteville where you never win. I think the last time we won there was 2008. And then on 5 days rest, you play Mississippi State. Find that. That was a brutal end of the schedule. That was the worst November Ole Miss has ever had schedule-wise. Nobody talks about that. Going into the schedule this time last year, you remember how everybody was talking about Kentucky? And do you remember how Kentucky was ranked 7th in the country? That turned out not to be the case because of injuries and whatever else happened. So it's crazy to either make excuses now and lay the groundwork or set Ole Miss up for failure with the schedule. When you're setting up talking points later, either way, it's just a foolhardy error. It just is. And if you look at difficult schedules, if you look at things that stand out, now I'm not saying Ole Miss's schedule isn't hard. Ole Miss's schedule is always hard. Ole Miss has the number one FPI strength of schedule this year, but that is because every team in the SEC and Big Ten make up the top 10. Last year, Ole Miss was like 5th. The year before, they were like 7th. It always happens. And the thing that makes them different is the SEC West is always difficult. The SEC West is always going to be accounted for. Normal does not make it brutal. It can't be brutal if it's the same thing that happens every year. The difference in this schedule is Georgia. Without Georgia, this year's schedule is actually less than last year's schedule. But that Georgia game doesn't matter because it's not going to be held against Lane Kiffin to begin with. So pay attention, understand what's going on with the schedule. Understand how fans are. Because media and fans alike, the ones that are uber optimist or uber pessimist, the way they look is the last data point. They stretch that to infinity. I talk about this all the time. My everydayers can attest to it. Ole Miss lost to Mississippi State last year. So Ole Miss is going to lose to them every year in the future. I mean, that's the way they work. And it's whenever you say it like that, it sounds silly. But Tulane was good last year. So Tulane is going to be good this year, even though they lost their generational running back and their quarterback completed 40% of his passes against USC against a defense that was not good. There's context. It's not just about winning. We're all happy that Tulane won that game. But honestly, Georgia Tech is probably the more difficult non-conference game that Ole Miss will play this year, even though Tulane is on the road. Remember, Southern Miss beat that team that beat USC on their home field last year. Southern Miss went to a bowl game. They did what they had to do. They played super back. They essentially played, Tecmo Bowl, their offensive unit, but they beat Tulane. They beat that team. So the 85 Bears are not coming through that door whenever we go to New Orleans. It's not going to happen. So understand there's 3 difficult games, right? And I will call them difficult, even though LSU technically is a 50-50 and the line says it's a 50-50. But you have 2 games that Vegas says is guaranteed losses for Ole Miss. Seriously. They just, when you look at the line that they put out ahead of time, you got Georgia that's favored by like 17, and you got Bama that's favored by, 12 or 13. I forget the number. And then the other line that came out was LSU, and LSU was favored over Ole Miss by 4 points. I think Ole Miss was favored over LSU last year by 4 points. So that's a 50-50 game. Auburn, it's going to be their Super Bowl. If you want a game where going on the road, it's going to be a cauldron. I've talked to people at Auburn. That game is going to be their Super Bowl. That game is going to be mega important to them. It just is. So anyway, thank you for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. Make your second listen Locked On SEC. And for our everydayers, tune in tomorrow as we might switch the offense, but any news of the day that breaks, we will be all over it with our normal, crazy opinionated style. Anyway, see you tomorrow.